So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Giulia Tercovich. I'm Assistant Director at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, at the newly established Brussels School of Governance. So first of all, thank you for joining us today for the first of two-day events on the future of diplomacy. This timely debate is jointly organized with the LAC Ideas. So let me say a big thank you to Christopher Coker and Sarah Kulikan, as well as to our very own Richard Egot for pulling together such a brilliant set of speakers. So during these 2 days, we will try to answer to the many questions arising around diplomacy. So can diplomacy manage the emerging new great power competition? What are the necessary diplomatic skills in 2020s? How is diplomacy changing under the growing influence of new digital instruments of communication? We will touch upon different types of diplomacy, from trade to cultural diplomacy. And we really hope you will engage in the debate today and tomorrow. On this, please note, and don't forget to post your question in the Q&A box. And note also that we are recording the event. I think I will stop here. Without any further ado, I will now leave the floor to Christopher Coker, chair of the first opening plenary session. Welcome again.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yes, and welcome to the audience. I'm director of LSE Ideas, which is the main foreign policy think tank of the London School of Economics, and we're delighted to be associated with the Brussels School of Governance. I'll be very brief. You've seen the program, so you know what the event is, which is why you're tuning in today. But we will be looking very broadly at the way in which diplomacy is changing. Some of the issues which were beyond the purview of diplomacy are now becoming part of diplomacy, and new technologies, of course, are one of the dynamics that is changing the diplomatic scene. The first panel today in our plenary session is looking at security and the traditional institutions, diplomatic institutions, asking whether they're fit for purpose, asking whether security is as important as it was. We are, of course, meeting against the backdrop of a global pandemic. I'm delighted to welcome on this panel three very distinguished speakers. I will announce them in order of speaking. Kishore Mahbubani, who was former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations twice, founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, and now distinguished fellow of the Asian Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And his latest book is prominently displayed behind him. You will see when he comes on the screen. He will be followed by Judy Dempsey, who's senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and she's had a very distinguished former career in journalism with the Financial Times and the International Herald Tribune. And finally, Peter Westmacott, who I heard described on BBC4 the other day as the ambassador to everywhere. He is former British ambassador to the United States, to France, and to Turkey, from where he's actually speaking today. They will speak in that order for 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to the Q&A. So please post up your questions as they occur to you so that I can see them coming in. So if we may turn first of all to Kishore.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Let me congratulate the Brussels Schools of Government and LSE Ideas for organizing this conference. It's very timely, and I hope that I can make a small contribution. I'm going to focus a lot on the role that Europe can play, especially in multilateral diplomacy. And the big message I want to convey is that Europe has a tremendous opportunity to become a key global player in multilateral diplomacy. But to do that, it's got to radically change course. And that's my big message. And to explain my argument, I'm going to make in 10 minutes 3 points, and I'll start with the bad news. It's always good to start with the bad news, and then the good news, and then hopefully a kind of a warning that explains why we need to change. So let me start with the bad news, I guess. It's important to understand that if you're going to prepare for the world of tomorrow, especially in the next 10 to 20 years, will be very different from the world of the past 10, 20, 30 years. And just to understand that, for someone from Asia, watching this incredible circus of the G7 meeting, Asians look at this and say, what the hell is going on here? Who are these people? Why do they think they can speak on behalf of the world? Who do they represent? There's 7.5 billion people in the world. And what they do, they represent 10% of the world's population. Worse still, in the year 1980, the G7 made up 51% of the world's GNP. Very serious. And developing Asia, excluding Japan, was 8.8%. By 2021, the G7 share has shrunk to 31%. Developing Asia had gone up to 32.9%. And I can assure you in 2030, 2040, the balance will shift even faster. So unless Europe and the rest of the world understands that power is going to shift to Asia, and you've got to learn to live with this now very loud, confident Asia, you cannot manage the world. So stop all these stupid circuses of G7 meetings, okay? They're absurd, but they carry on. That's an example of what I mean, the bad news. You got to change course. Secondly, you also know, and this is what, as you said, Christopher, my book As China Won is about, I guarantee you that in the next 10 to 20 years, the US-China geopolitical contest will gain momentum. And we saw this. It was started by Trump. It passed seamlessly to Biden. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat. This is driven by deep structural forces. And whether we like it or not, all of us are going to be affected by it, including Europe. And the third point I'm going to make, just to set the larger global picture, is that it's also becoming clear, if there's one big metaphysical message that COVID-19 should have sent to us, is that all of humanity is now one. Let's get serious, okay? Don't bother locking up your country. You can lock up your country, COVID-19 will enter, right? So we have to live and function as a common humanity if we want to deal with the world of tomorrow. So these are the huge, big changes coming our way. And if you still continue with the old circuses of G7 meetings, you fail to understand how much the world has changed. So all this brings me to my good news. And my good news is that if there's one region that has a tremendous geopolitical opportunity in the next 10 to 12 years, it's Europe, especially the European Union. Why the European Union? It is by far the most successful regional multilateral organization. I mean, I live in Southeast Asia. I would say ASEAN is number 2, but it's far behind European Union in terms of multilateralism. And clearly the answer to all the things that I mentioned, all the challenges I mentioned in my part 1, the answer is more multilateralism. That's what the world needs in the next 10 to 20 years. And who better to deliver it than the European Union and the European states? Because you actually, Blinken can talk about rules-based order, but Europe lives with a rules-based order. You know what that means. But of course, to do that, Europe has got to make some significant U-turns. 3. The first significant U-turn is, and I say this having been ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, stop being a complicit partner of the United States in weakening the United Nations and the family of UN institutions. You doubt that statement? Let me give you some statistical evidence. In the year 1970-71, the World Health Organization's budget, 62% came from regular budgetary funds. You make long-term plans from regular budgetary funds. Only 18% came from extra budgetary or voluntary funds. So the World Health Organization could make long-term plans on the basis of predictable financing. Come 2006, guess what? Regular budgetary funds have gone down from 62% to 28%. Voluntary, unreliable, extra budgetary funds have gone up to 72%. How do you run an international organization when you say 72% of its funding is going to come from voluntary donations? How are you going to recruit long-term health inspectors? How are you going to build up your capacity to deal with future pandemics if World Health Organization is going to rely on voluntary funding? So you can see this happened. I saw this in my own eyes at meetings of the 5th Committee at the UN. The second thing, the second U-turn that EU needs to make is to say that what the world needs, if you want to hear the views of the 7.5 billion people in the world, create strong global parliamentary institutions. It's hard to start from scratch, but fortunately we have something which is rubbish so much, which is called the UN General Assembly. And let's see, if you want to hear the views of humanity, walk into the General Assembly. Again, I'll give you a concrete example. Everybody's very concerned about the situation in Xinjiang, and we should worry about the situation in Xinjiang. Let's table it for discussion at the UN General Assembly. And let the West, right, which makes up 12% of the world's population, listen to the 88% who live outside the West. That's what global democracy is about. And Europe can provide that by championing the UN General Assembly. And the third point, of course, is that, you know, as I said earlier, the European Union embodies the rules-based order. You know, in the greatest achievement of the European Union is not that you have zero wars. You have zero prospect of war. I mean, you can argue all you want about Northern Ireland. UK and France, UK and Germany are not going to go to war again. That's a stupendous human achievement. Just imagine that the rest of the world could achieve that, achieve what Europe has achieved. It would be a fantastic world, especially in Asia, right? But to do that, you got to make sure that everybody complies with the rules, including the world's #1 power, which is the United States of America. And as we know, the United States has launched several illegal wars over the past 2 decades. I'm glad that France and Germany opposed the Iraq war, but subsequently, Europe just kept quiet. And the tragedy here is that it is actually in America's national interest to have a rules-based order. And Bill Clinton said this in a speech in Yale in 2003. If you believe that we should be trying to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in when we are no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then he says, then you wouldn't go around weakening multilateral institutions. So it's also in America's national interest. So in 1 or 2 minutes that I have left, let me emphasize that it's also in Europe's interest to become the champion of multilateralism, because the #1 challenge to Europe in the next decade or 2 is not going to come from Russian tanks. It's going to come from the demographic explosion in Europe, in Africa. In 1950, Europe's population was twice that of Africa's. Now Africa's population more than doubled. By 2100, Africa's population will be 10 times the size of Europe. Europe will benefit from a rules-based order. And guess what? Europe will also benefit from greater Chinese investment in Africa. So if you want me to give one simple suggestion for a diplomatic conference that I believe, that I assure you is completely inconceivable today, that would be great for Europe, is to organize a conference of all the African leaders, combined with all the European leaders, combined with China, because China is the biggest investor in Africa today. Every piece of investment that China makes in Africa will help to reduce the outflow of migrants in Africa. So you can see a convergence of interest there, but it requires us to step out of our box and to say, goodbye G7, let's welcome a different world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kishore. In fact, President Macron, I think, has described the immigration challenge as, to use his own words, the greatest civilizational challenge to the future of Europe. Not quite sure what he means by that, but anyway, it's certainly, I think, the #1 challenge the EU probably faces. But Judy, would you agree with that? There's some challenging things here, good news for Europe and bad news for Europe, but I don't know whether you want to concentrate on Europe, but over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher, and hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. Well, I don't think I will take up some of Kishore's arguments. They're pessimistic enough as they are, frankly. I do agree about the G7, but let me give you some of my thoughts. They are, I suppose, focused a lot on Europe, but they say an awful lot about the state of international diplomacy. I think it's diplomacy is an immensely woolly word. It's an immensely complex word, and it's very, very challenging as well. When there's a problem, get the diplomats to fix things. And the world of diplomacy has changed rapidly, but it doesn't communicate itself in terms of the changes that are taking place. And what has been very interesting over the past couple of years is how I use it, the European diplomacy or the Western or American diplomacy has very badly managed the kind of offensive diplomacy coming out of Turkey, coming out of Russia, coming out of China, particularly how it uses its wolf diplomacy to intimidate journalists, to intimidate governments, to intimidate businesses. So what we have now are two schools of diplomacy. One is the traditional tools of diplomacy, of dialogue, of consultation, of talking, and the other one is the offensive diplomacy, which is quite obstructive. And it's rather a diplomacy built on, as I said earlier, intimidation and intimidation in the absence of a dialogue. And what we see is these two schools, one based on the dialogue and the other based on confrontation. And it's very difficult at the moment to see how they're reconciled. And clearly Biden was trying to find some way around this yesterday in Geneva with President Putin. This is the first thing. The secondly, how do you respond to this kind of new diplomacy? Well, we saw that Trump didn't respond to it because he sacked or got rid of an awful lot of talent in the State Department. And in fact, in some ways, he played that kind of aggressive language, which didn't go very far in terms of trying to ameliorate the extraordinarily difficult challenges which we're all facing now. It's multilateralism, it's the collapse of arms control, it's demography, it's immigration, it's pandemics. I mean, the shopping list is absolutely huge. And precisely because the shopping list is so big, all the more reason to have diplomacy. However, and since we have stellar diplomats on this panel, I'm convinced more and more that the old school of diplomacy, although it's changing, it has to radically change. And it has to radically change in a number of ways. First of all, diplomats and who have built up years of experience have to become much more inclusive in bringing in civil society, business interests, and other aspects of society, and trying to reconcile values and interests. This is very tricky for foreign policy, and it's always been a very uneasy tension, but the tension at least can be articulated if the arena for diplomacy, consultation and dialogue is widened. In other words, if you want to deal with Lavrov, as the EU really got its fingers burnt a couple of months ago, A, you have to go very well prepared, but B, preparing means actually listening to others outside the immediate diplomatic circle. So the more voices and input you can get, I think the better in terms of coming up with a very coherent a very coherent set of values and interests. You'll never get them all balanced properly, but at least you try to be more inclusive and that there won't be a divide and rule from the other side or indeed from within. I think this is very, very important. The other issue is, and I think I've seen, interestingly, the British diplomats were very active in Bulgaria a few years ago. An old colleague of mine was based there and he was endlessly using social media, but he was the younger generation. We need more of this. Social media has its own bubble, like diplomacy has its own bubble, like multilateral institutions have their own bubble. But diplomacy has to use social media much more in getting its ideas across. Governments cannot rely on press conferences. They're kind of a bit old-fashioned, actually, in many ways. They've got to use social media and get the message out. This is not beating the competition. It's actually, in some ways, explaining to a wider public why certain decisions are needed and the implications for values and interests. I do stress this values and interests. And in some ways, Kishore didn't really go on this, but this is one of the, I suppose, raison d'etre of the European Union, but you wouldn't think so sometimes, given the state of corruption and other issues inside the EU itself. So the fourth thing is for diplomacy and diplomats, and this is really very, very difficult. And when I talk about diplomats, it's just not the bilateral relations with other countries, it's the multilateral organizations. The bubble is still there. And when you live in a bubble, the bubble gets confirmed by your colleagues. And I've discussed this several times with the EAS, the European Action Service, and embassies in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus and here in Europe and Germany. Diplomats have to get out of the capitals, go to the small cities, towns, to explain what our Western views are. And when I talk about diplomacy, I'm talking about the Western idea of diplomacy, of values, of liberal orders too wishy-washy, but of projecting certain ideas of the rule of law, particularly, and of the social contract. And two other issues, just to conclude, because diplomacy has become so complex, because the world has become increasingly complex with globalization, with the pandemic, the Europeans and even the United States, the West is particularly bad at crisis management. It's very, very slow at reacting to crisis, although we see what we can actually project what is going to happen in certain countries, whether it's Africa or Southeast Asia, but reacting very, very slowly, although we have certain tools and instruments. The crisis management modus operandi is still unbelievably weak, and so much could be done in this. But I think a fundamental flaw in having a diplomatic answer or diplomatic response to the extraordinary challenges not facing the next 15 years or 10 years, it's 5 years. The speed of change is so quick. It's a fundamental weakness in the West, in the sense that we don't have a common threat perception. The Northern Europeans differ from the Southern Europeans. France has its own threat perception, which is the Sahel, which is terrorism, which is part of Africa. Germany has its own complexes, which we can go into later. Britain had a strategic culture and still has a strategic culture, but essentially there isn't one overarching strategic culture inside the European Union. And indeed, in the West generally, there isn't one overarching strategic culture, whether we're talking about how the Europeans see the United States or Canada or Australia or South Korea, the bigger, wider issue of the West. We don't have a common strategic culture. And because we don't have a common strategic culture, it's actually very difficult in dealing with my first point, how authoritarian regimes can actually manipulate and use their own diplomats or their own foreign policy interests to project what they want. And my final point is, and I think maybe Kishore, I will take you up on this, and I probably agree with you. The G7 I think its day is over, but it's all very well criticizing multilateral institutions, but you have to replace them with something. And I would suggest two things. One is the idea of the West built on the 1945 order is over. The idea of the transatlantic relationship is over in the old sense. These multilateral institutions were built in 1945 in order to deal with the Cold War and the whole divisions of the East and West. This is over. It needs radical reform of these institutions, and it must be wider and more inclusive. Secondly, diplomacy has to anchor itself on redefining trade accords. This is very important. The transit line, the TTIP, America-Europe trade accord would have been the perfect example for projecting transparency, values. It would have actually deepened the rules-based order. And indeed, it's a great pity that the Americans pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Pact. The Europeans should get back into this, or get into it actually, and widen the nature of the value system, widen the nature of the West. The old West doesn't carry credibility anymore, and it's very old-fashioned. And in some ways, it's an insult to those in to the countries in Southeast Asia and Australia and others. So this is how I would see diplomacy. It's got enormous challenges, but fundamentally, diplomacy, if it has to work, it's going to need many more allies, but it's got to have a shared common threat perception and a shared strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And your point, I think, about crisis management, I would say more likely to be risk management than crisis management in many ways, is very reactive. And in fact, there was a House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee accusing the government of going in for a culture of firefighting and always reacting to events rather than being proactive. So that certainly what you had to say echoes that. Peter, can we turn to you finally, as a diplomat of enormous experience over several countries, different countries? Would you like to engage with some of the ideas you've heard, or develop your own points?
Well, thank you, Christopher, and thanks to the others on the panel for some really very stimulating comments. Let me respond a little bit to what I've heard and perhaps toss in a couple of ideas of my own. I wouldn't disagree that the post-1945 world order and the institutions which we put together then to try to stop the war, stop the world going back to another world war and create an element of stability and peace and prosperity is probably, I won't say it's past its sell-by date, but it certainly does need reviewing. But being somebody who's been a diplomat all my life, I'm often wary about breaking things up if I haven't got a reasonably clear idea of what I want to put in its place. And I heard what the others were saying about G7. I have to admit that last week when I was asked a bit about whether the G7 meeting had been of any value in Cornwall, I said I thought it had. I take Kishore Mahbubani's point that the amount of global GDP represented by those 7 countries is dramatically less than it was. And I kind of understand the point that the Chinese government was making when it says the moment has passed when a handful of countries thinks that it can tell the rest of the world how to behave. But in a sense, I didn't think the 7 were doing that. I think it was useful in that it brought together 7 leaders of genuinely democratic countries for the first time in a long time. It was a chance for the new President of the United States to see and get the measure of some of the other global leaders. And of course, it wasn't just G7, there was also time spent with the British royal family, time spent with NATO leaders, time spent with EU leaders, time spent with President Putin in the space of 6.5 days. So I think it was a useful opportunity for people to get the measure of each other and to look at some of these ways in which the world is a different kind of place to how it was either back in the days of the Cold War or in the more optimistic times of the post-Second World War period when we were putting together all those institutions. Because things are different. A lot has changed, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years. We've had a different sort of American president who, amongst other things, has ushered in and given a certain kind of respectability to what I would call a post-truth world, and to some extent kind of surrendered the moral leadership that much of the world felt that the United States represented. He's now gone, but there is undoubtedly a sense amongst many of America's admirers and allies, as well as those who are just watching to see what happens, that they're not entirely sure whether the return of a democratic president who believes passionately in human rights and a rules-based order is the last gasp of, if you like, consensual principled multilateralism, or whether this is in fact the return to normality and that America is going to be a more predictable and a more principles-based and a more internationalist rather than unilateralist global power. And I think we don't have the answers to all those questions, but I'm pretty strong in my own sense that the 4 years of President Trump, and it might yet be replaced, who knows, in a few years' time by another Trump or another Trump clone, have altered perceptions of America and have altered perceptions of the way in which statesmen and businesses and countries deal with each other. And it's given a certain encouragement to autocrats in other parts of the world to feel that they can carry on doing pretty much what they like without anybody standing up to them. Then we've got, of course, a kind of belated realization of the rest of the world of the enormous importance of China. China flexing some muscles, China asserting itself, China scaring in some way some of the other regional powers around the South China Sea. China using, I would say, a slightly different emphasis to what Dr. Mahbubani was saying, using investment in parts of Africa, not so much as a means of raising prosperity levels, but actually of increasing China's economic leverage in many of those countries. And some of the deals and some of the financing which has been provided, most of which, by the way, does not include local employment at all, have not been very good. And there have been too many unfinished projects where the financing has simply been withdrawn. Dependence has been increased and some not terribly good deals have been struck. That said, I'm delighted to see Chinese banks performing the role of development banks, which was primarily something which the Western institutions used to be doing almost entirely. And when I was in Washington, I remember being pretty sharply criticized by the US government for the UK government being a founding member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I thought was part and parcel of China actually assuming its international responsibilities in a way that the rest of us should have and did in many ways engage with. But there are some very big questions out there. There's the whole business of wolf diplomacy that Judy was talking about. There's what is the real intention of the Belt and Road Initiative. There's Xinjiang, there's Hong Kong. There are a number of issues out there. I think there's a lot of potential for others to engage with China rather than just be terrified of it. But it requires, I think, a more collegiate, a collective, not name-calling approach. And I'd like to see other countries coming together with China in a way that everyone can benefit from. It's not as if China is trying to destroy stuff. It's not as if China is invading next door neighbors. It's not a threat in that sense, but it is a big challenge, as President Biden and others have mentioned. And there are people who are scared that if it's not managed, that we might see, God knows, some sort of conflict around Taiwan if China continues to, if you like, flex its muscles in its own backyard. We've got Russia, which has had something of a free pass, although let's not forget that even the Trump administration did expel a large number of Russian spies from America and did join international consensus when Russia was caught behaving badly, trying to poison opponents in other sovereign countries. But I think whether we were looking at Eastern Ukraine, or whether we're looking at Crimea, whether we're looking at some of the cyber warfare that Russia's been indulging in, it's been doing its own thing and sort of going back to the days of Lenin that we all like to repeat, which is probe with bayonets, and if you feel mush, push on, and if you feel steel, withdraw. It's always fun to drag up these statements, but there's a bit of that, I think, in it. And what I like to think that we saw in Geneva in the last few days was a US president who was not interested in name calling, who was interested in getting the measure of a man whom he already knows well. I think one of the benefits for the international community is that we have a new president who is, in a sense, an old hand. He's been around the block. He chaired the Foreign Relations Committee. He chaired the Judiciary Committee. He knows 100-odd world leaders. He's not starting from scratch. And so he also is a man who takes enormous trouble to brief himself. Not just talking to diplomats, Judy, but also talking to academics and others who know about Russia and who know Russian language and culture and history, to try to ensure that he is a man who is well briefed when it comes to these meetings. And I thought that here was an important moment when, even if the specific concrete results, something on nuclear arms control, something hopefully on cyber warfare, something on the return of ambassadors, These were useful results, and more yet may come from it. And of course, in parentheses, I think that putting ambassadors back in Moscow and Washington also underlines what the others were saying, that there is still a role for diplomats to do diplomacy. And I think it's unfortunate that there are times when you don't have ambassadors there. One of the reasons why, when I was a British diplomat, we used to find we had an important dialogue with the United States of America, was that for however many years it is, more than 40 years since the Iranian Revolution, America hasn't had a diplomat on the ground in Iran, and yet Iran is in many ways the Middle Eastern country which has taken up the most bandwidth of US diplomacy for the last 4 decades, bar none, except possibly Israel. So having people who do know a bit about the country and the language and what's going on and can provide context and perhaps tactical advice, I think is valuable. And when it's not there, I think that is missing. Then we've had, of course, the drama caused to all of our lives and the suffering from the pandemic. Leaving aside all the vaccine diplomacy and so on, which I think is beginning to bring us all together. The fact is that I think the way in which, to take a tiny example, Jaguar Land Rover had to down tools and stop producing vehicles in the UK in the first few days almost after the Wuhan announcement that we got this virus out there, was a sign of the interconnectedness, of the length of the supply chains, of the just-in-time global economy that we've developed, which in one sense was marvelous because it does show that we're all in this together. But in another sense, it showed that we probably got too much interdependence. And people are now revisiting resilience in terms of business, but also in terms of relationships. And that brings me for a moment back to diplomacy, in the sense you can certainly argue the Security Council, the General Assembly, the European Union, NATO, many of these great organizations that we've put together over the years and love and treasure have not always been very effective at dealing with issues. And so what we're seeing now, as we enter a new world, post-pandemic, hopefully soon, is a more kind of pragmatic way in which nation states, because we're sort of going back to the Westphalia pattern of nation states rather than the multilateral organizations which have dominated international proceedings recently, come together in a pragmatic way. It might be the Quad of the Indo-Pacific, or it might be the E3, or it might be the P5+1 that negotiated the Iran deal, or it might be the Kiev 4, or it might be other countries trying to sort out the future of Syria. It's sort of horses for courses and pragmatism, and where can we make a difference? And I welcome that. I think that's important, and that's introducing a new degree of flexibility into international arrangements, and I would like to think problem solving. And my last little point, and then I'll stop and we can have a proper discussion of questions, is really just to say that whether it was at Geneva or last week, or whether it is in having proper conversations with, let's say, Chinese leadership, whether it is working out where's the European Union going in future, whether it's the British government trying to decide what it means by global Britain after it's left the EU, which is something personally I regret, because I think we may find it harder to be a force for good and usefulness in the international community. I do believe that there is still a need for diplomacy and diplomats. Of course, they shouldn't live in a bubble, Judy. I like to think that as an ambassador, I spend a lot of time with business leaders, a lot of time with civil society, a certain amount of time out in the streets doing pride marches with my T-shirt, Pride Not Prejudice, going back to the soft power of British literature. And if you like, talking to a lot of different organizations and people. I did more than 100 official visits outside the US Beltway as British ambassador to the United States, because I thought, as you have rightly said, diplomats should get out and about and talk to other people. They also need to be a lot more diverse. Right now, every single top-notch British ambassador abroad is female. And that's pretty new. We weren't like that even just a very few years ago. Maybe I got lucky. If I was coming to the top of my profession now, I might not get a top job anymore. But I think all that is good, and there is change, and we are learning about crisis management. I have a little bit of a view about crisis management, which is that it's absolutely right to be ready for it. But almost by definition, if you can see it coming, it's probably not going to be a crisis. So it's about preparedness rather than always being able to anticipate when things go wrong. one of the nastiest things I had to deal with was a very large suicide bomber who brought a truck into the British Consulate General in Istanbul when I was ambassador in Turkey, killing a lot of people and doing an enormous amount of damage. Could we have seen it coming? Possibly. There could have been some intelligence dots joined together more effectively, but frankly, that was a counsel of perfection. Were we well placed in order to deal with that and pick up the pieces and deal with the human and political and diplomatic consequences? Not as well as I would have wished, but we did our best. So I think what I'm saying really is, yes, let's try and have the highest possible level of preparedness, but let's not fool ourselves that we can see trouble coming. We've just got to be ready to be agile and nimble and intelligent, dealing with it when it does happen. And for that, just as for the whole purpose of briefing heads of government, international organizations, talking on different panels and so on, I think the local expertise, the relationships, the knowledge, the understanding of different parts of the world, which diplomats doing their job can represent, and the tactical advice and the context they can provide as background for really important negotiations, I like to think, but of course I'm prejudiced, is still something that remains of great value. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. I would like to start off, if I may, the discussion by asking them respective questions. If we can do it in reverse order, Peter, since you're on the screen now, can I just follow up, because you have enormous experience in the United States. You did say that Biden, unlike his predecessor, is a man who listens to advice, is interested in the people that he's talking to, but he has used an undiplomatic language in his first 100 days in power, calling Putin a murderer and Xi Jinping a thug. And I wonder if you would see this as indicative of a kind of Western high morality from a country that feels it's actually sitting at the top of the moral order, that used to give lectures to China on human rights, on Tibet, on various other things of this kind. But what it really shows is what Joe Nye has called a reluctance to share the service of public provisions and public services that the United States, in fact, invented with the UK and other countries at the end of the Second World War. In other words, it's not willing to share. It hasn't come to terms with what people call a post-hegemonic world, or others call a post-Western world, and some call a post-American world. And that is a problem for everyone, including for the European Union as well. What would your response be to that?
I'm not sure I see it quite like that. I sense that with the Biden administration, you are dealing with a team, the tone, of course, set from the top, which is genuinely attached to issues like human rights and tolerance and rule of law and freedom of expression, and opposed to persecution and discrimination and genocide and the murder of one's political opponents. They just, this is who they are. They feel why they were elected. I don't think it's intended to be finger pointing and telling others how to behave. I can understand why that comes across like that sometimes, and we can all be guilty of it. And I don't think it's about refusing to accept that there's a post-hegemonic world. I sense that the United States, certainly under current management, is ready and willing to engage with partners, but it does believe that there are certain international norms, and they are encapsulated in the Charter of the United Nations and a number of other international bodies that we all belong to, which should be respected without believing or claiming that America in itself is free of fault. Many things go wrong in America, as President Biden is the first to admit. Much of it is not because it's government organized, government authorized, or government instigated, but some aspects of it, the way in which public life has evolved in America, for example, the vast influence of money invested interests in leading to the way legislation and justice are performed in America, I think is not quite what the founding fathers had in mind, and America needs to be aware of its own, if you like, flaws, or the way in which it's evolved. So do other Western democracies and others. So I think it's about the attachment to the values rather than a refusal to accept new realities. And I think if there was a way in which the United States could come to terms with, if you like, a form of coexistence with a Russia, which was not going to indulge in cyber warfare and murdering of its opponents outside the country or even inside the country. And if there was a way in which it could come to terms with a very large and a powerful China, who after all has a huge interest in the continuing prosperity of the global economy and massive investments in US dollars and so on, I personally think that we have a US president who would be delighted, who would be applauding from the rooftops.
Thank you. We have actually a question coming up on America and grand strategy, but I'll wait for the moment. Judy, can I come to you? And can I ask you to engage with Kishore's argument that there's a unique opportunity for the European Union to play a very specific role? But there are two things I wanted to raise there. First, he was, I don't think he was taking into account how much Russia is seen as a strategic threat. It is very difficult for the European Union to deal with without the United States. But the other thing is, I was thinking of a report that was published by the Council, a European Council on Foreign Relations, about whether the Europeans can think strategically. Yeah. And looking at the different defense white papers of the different members of the community, of the union, I should say, they found that 2 countries could do grand strategy. Other countries mostly did regional strategy. Some countries only did local strategy, and 1 or 2 countries didn't do strategy at all. They were basically relying on everyone else. You talked about strategic culture. There isn't a strategic culture for the European Union. So if there is to be strategic autonomy, as Macron and others would like, it's going to be very, very difficult. So anyway, could you just broadly engage the question of how Europe can seize the opportunities to play a more viable, forceful role in international affairs?
Nothing like an easy question. First of all, I just wonder, do they really want to play this role of being a global player? Because it means responsibility, it means making hard decisions, it means actually hard power, and it actually means what you say, a common strategic culture. And we actually lack all 4. And we lack all 4 because, primarily because there's huge diverging interest between Germany and France. And the European Union, as the EU, could make a big difference, especially with regard to Russia and our future relationship with Russia, if actually Germany took a much greater leadership on the political and strategic front. Germany does not act strategically, it does not think strategically, and it hides behind multilateralism in some ways, but this is not enough. Angela Merkel had many, many chances to deal with Putin, whether it was Nord Stream, whether it was Navalny, whether it was the cyber attacks of the Bundestag, whether it was the murder of a Czech in broad daylight in Berlin. And yet there's this kind of ambiguity in Germany, which has held up European foreign policy. Now, some can say, oh, well, it's easy to blame Germany, but actually Germany is crucial. And heaven knows what will happen after the next elections. And it's very interesting that the head of the domestic intelligence services here in Germany, I'm based in Berlin, by the way, have warned that Russia is going to meddle even further in the elections because they do not want the Greens to win. And the Greens are the only party that's been consistently critical of Russian human rights and of China. This is the first thing. Secondly, the problem with the European countries is that they mention the word strategic autonomy, but in fact they're not ready for it. It's not just because of the lack of strategy; they don't have the capabilities. But above all, they are afraid. They are afraid of Europe being Europe, and it will weaken this transatlantic bond. And the fact is that in some ways the United States would like Europe to take much more control, interest and attention to its own backyard, the Western Balkans. It's so still unfinished business and we won't do it. And it's not even about crisis management. We don't need a crisis management in that sense. It's there in front of us. And somehow there's an inertia. And I think the real weakness of the EU now is that power lies with the member states. It doesn't lie with the Commission. Europe is not coherent. Europe is not united. And until we actually have this unity, the member states will call the shots and Europe will actually get weaker and more disunited rather than stronger. Sorry, Kishore.
And if I can now move on, thanks, Judy, to Kishore yourself. You were talking essentially that the West as a political concept no longer has much traction, and Judy was mentioning the transatlantic relationship. I think Peter was referring to it as well. But surely the big challenge for Westerners is that we're entering into a world of what's called value pluralism now, where everyone has to respect each other's different value systems, harmony with, I forget what the Chinese formulation is, harmony with difference. And the EU in particular is a normative organization. I mean, that's what it is. That's what distinguishes it from ASEAN, for example, or other institutions, rightly or wrongly. And it's quite strong on exporting its norms to its own near abroad, like the Balkans or the Eastern neighborhood. So what is your response to that observation of mine, that Western countries, call them G7 countries or whatever, are really stuck with a normative agenda which they're not really willing to compromise on at this stage? And therefore your hopes that the EU will be specifically different and distance itself from the United States are, I think, unlikely to be realized, certainly in the short term.
Yes, I mean, I think we would be happy, we would live in a better world if the West stuck to its values. I think we want to see a world where there's greater respect for human rights. We want to see a world where there's no torture. We want to see a world where there are no illegal wars. We want to see a world where innocent civilians are not being bombed. I think those values are wonderful. But I think the one piece of caution I have here is that it's a huge mistake for the West to put itself on a pedestal of virtue and assume that the West is much more virtuous than the rest of the world. Because the record doesn't show that, sadly. I mean, if you look at even the last 20 years since 9/11 happened, it is Western forces that have killed 800,000 innocent civilians in illegal wars in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. And this is the Brown University Watson Institute data, okay? So if you have, unfortunately, especially in the last 20 years, created what the only way to describe it is killing machines. And frankly, it's not in the interest of the West to do that. It's definitely not in the interest of the West to do that. And at the same time, the West has got to live with an uncomfortable world. And I say uncomfortable because, when you say world, by the way, immediately when you hear the world, you must inject into the word world 1.4 billion Chinese, 1 billion Hindus, 1.3 billion Muslims, 500 million Buddhists. And then you begin to realize that the world today is actually very different from the world of yesterday. And the good news I have, and I want to emphasize, is that most of the 88%, if they have the aspirations in their personal lives, what they aspire to achieve in their personal lives is the very comfortable, good middle-class living that the West has achieved. I mean, that is ultimately, I can tell you also, the Asian dream. So there can be, in many ways, what I call a convergence of values, in the sense of saying, let's take care of our families, let's take care of our communities, let's improve our lives, let's stay peaceful. And so it can be done. And that's why I gave the positive example of the European Union, where you have zero prospect of war. And that, at the end of the day, is what the world should have. Zero prospect of war between any two countries in the world, especially between US and China, or China and Japan, or India and Pakistan, and I can go on, so on and so forth. But to achieve that, I also want to emphasize that the West has been so unusually dominant for 200 years that it has lost the art of listening. I'm actually quite shocked at that. I studied Western philosophy, in university. So I understand the power of reasoning, and I'm a great, fan of the Western Enlightenment. At the end of the day, it's the power of reason can conquer everything. And I believe that reason actually can cross cultures. I've always found when I was ambassador to the UN, I found the only way to make sure that my speech could get through 6 different languages after translation was to make sure I spoke clearly and logically and using Western logic. So it can be done. But at the same time, the West has got to understand that the rest of the world, in many critical respects, is not going to become westernized anymore. And so there's a huge difference between the huge modernization of East Asia, but the non-westernization of East Asia. That's a huge difference. So, you know, they will appreciate many of the, how do you say, the quality of life and all that. But at the same time, their culture, they're rediscovering their own culture. So the world of tomorrow can be summarized in 3 M's, okay? It'll be multipolar, it will be multi-civilizational, and multilateral. And the best way actually to handle a multipolar, multi-civilizational world, which is going to be in a sense that the structure of the world of tomorrow, is to strengthen the current multilateral institution. And I would say, frankly, that the great thing about the Western Enlightenment, the big difference, the big leap forward you make was that you abandon the feudal structures. And you said you can no longer have a world where a few dukes and aristocrats can make decisions. No, the people shall make a decision. And that same principle, the same transition that the West made, going from having a few feudal lords making decisions on behalf of societies to having everyone have a say, is the same transition that we need to make, because the West has been functioning as feudal lords for the last 200 years, colonizing the world, controlling the world, making decisions for the world, having circuses like G7, you know, so that world has got to be replaced by a world where you listen to other voices. And the good news I want to give you is that the 88% who live outside the West actually want to work with the West, want to improve the world, want to focus on killing COVID-19, want to focus on taking care of climate change. That's actually a great convergence that is happening. But this great convergence requires a global democracy in the real sense, where you actually listen to different voices telling you, we have a different view of the world. And that's why we need to resuscitate diplomacy. And just to emphasize a key point in diplomacy, though, diplomacy was invented 2,000 years ago, not to enable you to talk to your friends. You don't need diplomatic immunity when you're going to see a friend. Diplomatic immunity was invented so you could talk to enemies, because when you went to enemy court, your head was chopped off. That's what diplomacy is about. And guess what? The most advanced Western countries, United States, will not establish diplomatic relations with North Korea, will not establish diplomatic relations with Iran. Why? Because they're enemies. Hey, excuse me, diplomacy was invented to enable you to talk to enemies. You need diplomatic immunity to talk to enemies. And these are the kind of basic fundamental mistakes. A refusal to accept that the world of tomorrow will be so vastly different. But it's a world that can be a happy one for the West, but it requires the West to go back to its original values of listening to everyone and listening to different points of view.
Thank you. Well, we've got a number of questions coming in. I'm going to identify 3. Please address them as you wish. One is from a British diplomat saying that we're talking today a lot about multilateralism, but what about bilateralism, which was traditionally essential to diplomatic practice, and particularly bilateral for smaller countries that don't get as much out of multilateralism as the bigger and the medium countries probably do. And also the other actors, the private security, private sector networks, non-state actors, etc., who are more involved in bilateral relations, perhaps rather than multilaterals. Second question is a very big one on the United States. What advice would you give the United States to adjust to the new realities? And the third question is about hierarchies. Are we actually moving from one hierarchical world into another hierarchical world? In other words, I suspect, do we trust China? Or do we think that China will wish to see itself at the apex of a triangle, want the respect that it's always craved, and expect to be respected in a way that it's certainly not respected by the United States at the moment. So those are 3 questions. Please address them as you wish. Peter, can we start with you?
Thanks. I think part of my answer is a little bit of a reply to Kishore Mahbubani. I absolutely take the point about listening to other civilizations and about the West not plonking itself, or more than plonking, climbing onto a pedestal of virtue, as he put it, and thinking that it's got all the answers and everybody else has to fall in line. And he and others have got some perfectly good, whataboutist arguments about the imperfections on the Western side. I think what I would say is that I think everybody has to adopt that same approach. And while, of course, it makes sense for other countries to rediscover their own culture, their own history, their own values, that is not necessarily the same as the rest of us respecting governments which are not reflecting the views of their people or even the culture of their civilization, terrified of dissent, more keen on staying in power and enriching themselves than on doing what is good for their country. And let's say in some cases, aggressing neighboring countries in the process, undermining the democratic processes in countries which prefer to have a freedom rather than autocratic government. I could go on, but I'm just saying, I think it is entirely legitimate, despite all the history, for countries which are attached to those values to stick to those values. We cannot by any means impose them on others, and others may not wish to do that. Certainly the rulers may not, even if the population in many cases would dearly love to have the freedoms that the rest of us hold dear. But what I think one can do is to engage between different countries, different cultures, different civilizations in ways that we're not necessarily demanding that they do things differently, but we do find ways in which we can come together to, shall we say, preserve the planet on which we have the privilege to live rather than destroy it. In other words, climate change, make our world more prosperous, help to bring more and more people out of poverty. China's done an extraordinary job of that, by the way, in recent years, but more trade, less tariffs, less sanctions, which only work when they are, in my judgment, specifically linked to a very specific problem. Otherwise, they're a very crude instrument of diplomacy. And I think there are lots of ways in which different countries, different entities, countries even with different values, should be able to find ways of working more closely together. And I think that's part of, maybe I'm wrong here, but I think that's part of the culture which President Biden is bringing to his conversations with people who have a very different starting point, but without being prepared to go along with cyber warfare in other countries, sovereign countries, and murdering your opponents in other countries, as I was saying before. I don't see any reason why we have to go along with that, and nor do I believe that it's part of the culture and civilization of other countries, which we absolutely need to respect. So I think that's an important point. The only other thing I would just say is bilateral relations as opposed to multilateral relations. As I was saying earlier, I think that some of the multilateral institutions which we've worked so hard to put together and to make work, and which are getting a bit clunky in their usefulness now, yeah, we do need to have the bilateral relationships. And in fact, guess what? It was always important to try to make those big organizations work properly, for key players to come together and agree on reform and on change, whether it's about NATO, whether it was even the creation of the single market in the European Union, whether it's about some of the things the Security Council has done usefully in New York. It often comes down to 2 or 3 of the key players coming together, working out what is the right way forward, and then taking the results of that diplomacy to others and seeing whether they can sell it to a bigger organization with a view to making it more effective at the international level. So absolutely, there's a role for the bilateral relationship just as much as there is for the international and multilateral ones.
Thank you. Judy.
Yes. First time I've used Zoom, I'm only joking. A couple of points. The West. This is a grossly overused term, because from the perception of outside, it's as if the West is setting the standards and the norms. The West embodies values, but in fact, these values are universal. And we forget about the universality of human rights and of the rule of law and freedom of the media. And this is what's happening in Myanmar now, and in Belarus, and in other areas. These are not Western inventions. They are universal values. And we should always try to remember this, because this is a tactic or a strategy or whatever by authoritarian regimes to demean the West, saying they're trying to impose our values. These values are universal. This is the first point. And this is why the United Nations is still very, very important for this. This is the first point. Secondly, bilateral versus multilateral. Well, it's neither or. And I have to be a bit prejudiced here, because when Ireland was faced with the Brexit negotiations, I have never seen such stellar Irish diplomats running around every single capital in the EU, and they did it bilaterally. And having got the big member states and the small member states on their side, as Peter argued, then they could go to Brussels with the kind of united voice. So there's room for actually both. However, what we see in the European Union, that certain countries outside the European Union, China for one, is quite skilled at dividing and ruling when it comes to bilateral relations. And we see this with Hungary and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. So there's a plus side and a downside to bilateralism and how it reconciles itself with multilateralism. And finally, your question, somebody asked, what advice to the US to make it adapt to the new realities? I mean, frankly, how the Europeans going to adapt to the new realities? What are these realities? They're shifting the whole time. And advice is probably not the right word. I mean, it's the kind of perception on where the West and our values are going. And this requires a dialogue, not only between the Europeans and the Americans and like-minded countries, but a dialogue with others as well. But at the end of the day, we are all after the same thing, which is universal rights, and it feeds into climate change. And I wonder, should the climate issue become a human rights issue?
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so Kishore, you will have the last voice, as you had the
okay, I know we're running out of time. I'll be very, very quick. I want to agree with Judy that actually the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a universal instrument and not a Western instrument, and we all should protect it, which is why, by the way, I want to say that I'm very glad that the West stood up when there's violation of human rights in Myanmar and Belarus. But when the United States was the first modern developed country to introduce torture, no European government, sadly, took the United States to the UN Commission, High Commission on Human Rights. But, you know, you're fortunate European civil society did it, but the European governments didn't do it. And the double standards are not good. Secondly, on the hierarchy question, there will always be a hierarchy in the world. But it's important, therefore, that global institutions must reflect the new balance of power. That's how they survive. So, and Martin Wolf said, a UN Security Council by the year 2020, he said, that has UK still in and India out, obviously doesn't represent the world of tomorrow. So we have to find a way of bringing a country like India into the UN Security Council. Otherwise, you know, it doesn't represent the world of tomorrow. Similarly, in the case of IMF and World Bank, when it was set up, the United States and Europe had about 60–70% of the world's GNP. So you had a rule that the head of the IMF must be a European, the head of the World Bank must be an American. But you know, this is 2021, and we still haven't got rid of that rule, even though the G20 meeting under Gordon Brown agreed that we should get rid of the rule. My final quick comment will be about China. And I think, you know, I want to emphasize that a very simple point, that China will be China. I don't know how to put this across, but you know, everybody believes that the Chinese government is only staying in power because it is suppressing 1.4 billion people. But there's a Harvard Kennedy School academic peer-reviewed study that shows that the support of the Chinese government among the Chinese people has gone up from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016. And I can tell you that the Chinese people have just enjoyed the best 40 years of human and social development in 4,000 years of Chinese history. So all you have to do is visit China, and you understand there's a kind of a spiritual vitality in the Chinese people that the West just doesn't get it. You look at today's column in the Financial Times by Jamil Anderlini, and he's clearly in a different planet. He doesn't understand that there's a different world that is emerging. Yes, the Chinese government is not going to behave like Western governments. But if the primary, someone meant, there's the Chinese fear is a word called luan, chaos. Any government that protects China from chaos is a government that protects the human rights of the Chinese people. And that's what the Chinese people know after 4,000 years of history.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very good note on which to conclude this session. Please stay with us in 15 minutes' time. There will be another panel, Economic Diplomacy and Economic Statecraft, which will be chaired by my esteemed colleague, Linda Yu. But I'd just like to thank our speakers on behalf of the organizers for coming here, sharing their observations, their provocations. The G7, I think we've decided, is perhaps its day may be over. But Ian Bremmer wrote a book some years ago about a G0 world, and that I think is the real challenge that we face, that we end up with a global governance gap, an absence of universal responses to universal challenges, and that's the purpose of diplomacy, is to ensure that we avoid that. Thank you very much for coming, sharing your time with us, and presenting your views. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.